This is the Middle-earth philosopher, where I talk about ideas, people, and relationships within Middle-earth and try to examine them from a philosophical point of view that people in that world may have held. This is the second video in my series of examining the philosophical points of view of the Gondorian civil war known as the Kin Strife. And this particular video is going to cover the worldview of Castamir, the leader of the renegade faction of the Gondorian civil war that temporarily defeats King Eldacar before he is then removed after a counterattack. So to start out with, it's important to recognize some of the backdrop a little bit behind Castamir. And that backdrop pretty much doesn't really involve him because he's not mentioned. That is, that as I mentioned in the previous video, that Valacar was sent up to Rovanion by his father Minotaur as an ambassador to basically keep tabs on the Rovanian tribes up there, as well as keep up good relations with them as well. During his stay up there, he fights alongside the Rovanian tribes, as well as falls in love with their culture as well, and takes a bride up there and starts a family. And that the people of Gondor hear about this. They're not happy about it, but it's not an issue at this point that's worth shedding blood over because it's happening in Rovanion, not in their front or backyards of Gondor, so to speak, even though Valacar is the heir to the king. Now, eventually, Valacar does return to take over the role of king from his father Minotaur. And this does become a problem now because now it is in the Gondorian nobles' faces because Valacar, like I said before, brings his Rovanian family, along with some Rovanian nobles as well, to the courts of Gondor. And this represents a major culture clash for the people of Gondor. That being said, it's still not at the point of violence quite yet. And that might be because, which I'll explore a little bit later on, of just the nature of how Valacar was raised in Gondor. That being said though, it does become an issue in 1432 to the point of violence when his son Eldacar then takes the throne. And that's when we enter the character of Castamir. Now, according to the sources, the only real thing known about Castamir is that he was a major person in the Gondorian Navy. He had an important role there. I think he was called the captain of ships, and he was also distantly related to the line of kings of Gondor. Now, when war does break out, it's implied that Castamir was not the only leader of this faction, but he was one of the major ones and becomes the lead player in that faction, eventually leading his armies to victory, or at least a temporary victory, when they take siege of Osgiliath and sack it. And at that point, Castamir captures one of Eldacar's sons and executes him. Eldacar is forced to retreat back to Rovanion for I think about a period of 10 years before he eventually returns with the Rovanian army that then sides with Gondorian nobles who have betrayed Castamir, and together they overthrow him and he is eventually killed during his conflict. That's the long and short of Castamir's story. But the really question I want to examine is why? Why did Castamir feel the need to shed blood over this particular issue of the role of king in Gondor? Well, I think a lot of it has to do with two things. One being that Gondor at this time is very insular. They're very traditional and conservative from my point of view as I read their stories. That they're very big on tradition and especially protective of their Numenorian heritage. And one of the major taboos there, though I don't think it was actually a legal law, was that the nobles of Gondor, at the very least, and especially the king, does not marry outside his race, meaning that he cannot marry a woman from any other race in Middle-earth other than someone from Gondor, and maybe potentially Arnor, though that's a question mark on that one, because of the Numenorian race and bloodline that runs through their veins. They want to protect that long life, and again, it's part of their cultural identity as well. So That leads to the second point about Castamir, in that he's what I would call a radical fundamentalist, in that Castamir believes, I think, that the lineage of the kings and the nobles of Gondor is worth shedding blood over. Now, if that's the case, then why didn't he do this during the reign of Valakar? Or for that matter, when Minokar was reigning and he sent Valakar up to Rovanion? And the main reason for that, I think, is that for Castamir, at that point, I don't think it was an issue. Again, Castamir is not even mentioned in the annals up until the point where Eldacar becomes king. And before that, we never hear of him. Which implies to me, at least, that this wasn't an issue of ambition and a coup. It was an issue where Castamir, along with others, felt that a red line had been crossed. Secondly, there's the issue of Valakar was at first raised in Gondor, and I implied this earlier in the video, so I'm going into it now, that basically, even though Valakar does adopt Rovanian culture and a Rovanian family, he was still primarily raised in Gondor, so he knows how Gondorians think, he knows how to behave, he basically knows how to work his way around the courts. That's the implication, at least. And I think because of that, that basically Valakar knew what to do and what not to do in the Gondorian courts, that gave him a free pass as far as his enemies in Gondor were concerned. Because at the very least, he wasn't completely shedding his Gondorian identity. However, with Eldacar, that is not the case. I think from the point of view of the Gondorian rebels, that Eldacar was essentially a half-breed, being that his mother was Rovanian and his father was Gondorian. But more importantly, possibly, would be that he was primarily raised in Rovanian. So both as a person, as blood, and culturally, he is Rovanian through and through. Now, I imagine that that would play a part in how he acted and how was perceived when his family arrives in Gondor. Maybe they gave him a hard time. Maybe he was not following the traditional rules and everything because he was or saw himself as Rovanian. But either way, Eldacar was the red line, whereas his father, becoming king, was not. Another important point to mention about Castamir, however, is that he lacks subtlety and any sense of nobility as one might perceive how a noble of any culture tends to act, in that he was noted for being a very hyper-violent person during this war, hence the execution or the killing of Eldacar's son during the sack of Osgiliath. It's said that this was close to crossing a line for even his allies, but it was happening to the other person. Basically, the enemy of my enemy is my friend, essentially, and he was getting the job done, which was getting the alien foreign king off the throne or getting rid of him permanently. So, at that point, it wasn't the problem, and it may have been a thing where they expected him to mellow out after the war was over, and that he would eventually become, a good king, as it were. But this doesn't happen, obviously. Which leads to the second point about Castamir, which is that he is very one-track minded. He's very single-minded and focused, in that he is not very aware of the feelings is kind of the wrong word for it, but for lack of better words, I'll just use that for right now. But basically the feelings of his allies and what they want from him as king, because Castamir wants to move the capital of Gondor to Peligir in the south, because he was very fond of Peligir. That seems to be where he's from. And in that sense, he's kind of very similar to Valakar in a way, in that both men come from or were raised or have come to love a particular portion of land and culture that they identify heavily with. So ironically, he's not that different in that sense. However, he lacks Valakar's sense of empathy and balance in terms of walking that line. So when he's talking about moving the capital, he was crossing another red line for his allies and Gondorian culture, and that they believe that Osgiliath has always been the capital of Gondor and should always be the capital of Gondor. Now, granted, that does change after the war, and they do eventually move the capital to Minas Tirith, but that was essentially because they had no choice, because the Civil War was so destructive that there was no saving Osgiliath after that. Regardless, though, Castamir even proposing this idea as king was a red line. And not only that, he was very violent. Again, he was very strict with people who disobeyed him or he considered enemies. And while it doesn't outright call him a tyrant, like on Sauron or even late Númenórean level, it was bad enough that his allies eventually turn on him and side with Eldacar when he returns, and come together to basically kick Castamir off the throne. So then, what can we say about Castamir's worldview as well as the man himself? Essentially, that Castamir represented everything that was the absolute worst about Gondorian culture at this point. That is, just how highly they valued the preservation of their culture as well as their bloodlines, and that he was willing to take it to the level of warfare in order to protect that, to the point where he was willing to go to war over it, that he was willing to go to war with the allies of Gondor over it, and that he was willing to even potentially break other Gondorian traditions that they held sacrosanct in order to keep that tradition and that fundamentalist view going. That's the philosophy of Castamir.